All right. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever this finds you. My name is Leora Wolf-Pursan, she, hers, here on Ohlone Land in the East Bay, California. So grateful to be with all of you in community. I'm the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center School Mental Health Lead, here with my colleagues in the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and our partners at the National Coordinating Office and many other centers across the country, all of us dedicated into learning and listening to long haulers and COVID-19 survivors. We're so grateful that you're here. Welcome. Today's session is being recorded. So if you're watching this or listening into this, not this morning, not this afternoon, but another day, we're so grateful that you are in learning. I know that I'll probably have to listen to this again because knowing Kira, knowing Mika, knowing Karla, knowing Jessica, and knowing Derek, there's going to be some incredibly powerful shares and learning and offerings today. As you are joining us, please make sure that your cursor is dropped down to panelists and attendees and share with us your name and where you are and what brings you to this conversation today. What brings you to this conversation? It's not only a gift to us, to everyone in the room, but it's also a gift to the folks who are sharing their stories, because it helps us feel connected in a virtual space, in a space that can sometimes feel disconnected. So I'm going to just go over a couple housekeeping lines before we move through. So again, welcome. If you are here with us today, you're here to be in listening and learning for an incredibly special event. An incredibly special event called the Mental Health Impacts of Surviving COVID-19, Implications for School Mental Health Systems Leaders and Providers. If you are not a school mental health leader and you still wanted to listen and learn, you are in the right place. If you are a school mental health leader and you wanted to listen and learn, you're in the right place. If you are a COVID-19 survivor and long hauler and are here for validation and affirmation, you're in the right place. And if you are many other things, you are here and we're so grateful. We are funded. We are funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, SAMHSA, and this presentation was actually co-presented and prepared by the Pacific Southwest and Northwest Mental Health TA Centers. If you are old friends of ours, welcome back. If you're new friends of ours, welcome. We're entering our 4th year in existence to serve you and support the school mental health workforce. We just want to offer that while we're grateful for the support, we also want to name that the views and opinions expressed today are of ours and the presenters only. So in taking a moment, you may have heard me say earlier that I am here, Leora, here based on Ohlone Land. And in thinking about what it means to both survive a pandemic and also be surviving a pandemic, because many of us are still in it, and being having an identity of identifying as a long hauler. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is not the only pandemic of harm and of struggle that many of us hold. And so I'm offering us in this moment to have a moment of quietness, to really be clear and root of what land we are either occupying or come from. And by land, I don't even just mean the physical land. I mean all the stories of all the peoples and communities that hold us in our constant need to either survive or in our constant determination to figure out how to live in our bodies and in the space and in the communities that we're navigating. So I'm going to offer you a moment, either in the chat box or just quietly, to either acknowledge the land that you are occupying or come from or honor, or just have a moment to have a little bit of quiet to think about all the people who have held you in years, generations, lifetimes of times that have been hard. And where there might be little glimpses of joy and teachings of joy. So if you feel called to, and if you know what native lands you are on or native peoples that you want to recognize, please feel free in the chat box. Or if there is another person or peoples or teachings that has helped you survive, at a time in your life or in your ancestor's life? Please put that in the chat box so we can learn from and with you. Thank you. Thank you for those of you who are doing that. So speaking of lands, we are, as I mentioned earlier, we are 2 TA centers that serve the Pacific Southwest and the Northwest. So we, Leora, and colleagues Livia and many others in this room serve the Pacific Islands, California, Hawaii, Nevada, and Arizona. Kelsey, Natalie, and team serves Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And we are the kind of marigold font in there, and we are funded to support the mental health workforce and the school mental health workforce. And we're so grateful to being able to do that. And one of the ways that we're doing that is to have conversations like this morning. Thank you so much for all of you that are putting where you are calling in from. I'm going to do another reminder to please have your drop down to panelists and attendees so that all of us can learn from each other. And I'm just going to continue to invite Natalie and Livia to help you remind each other. Okay. So on that note, a couple things about what brings us together today. What brings us together today is that we are hoping to live into the values that hold up the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center network, the network that I just shared with us. We are really wanting to commit to being strength-based, to being healing-centered and trauma-informed, and to being particularly inviting all of us to participate in their own journey. And that's going to be really alive for us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. And I'm going to invite us, again, as I said earlier, in the chat box and in our own learning, to really sit with how we can be recovery-oriented, not only in our language, but in our commitment to understanding those we work with and those we serve, and our own bodies in a way that really guides us by what we're holding on to and what we want to release and what we might want to take on and embrace for others. Okay, so hopefully you all feel open and welcome. There's almost 150 of us in the room. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so grateful for you taking your time to be learning with us. We're going to start this morning with a conversation around even what long haul COVID is. Many of us, like I said earlier, are kind of in new understanding of that. And so we want to start this morning with what even is long haul COVID, with a brief level setting with what we know and what we don't know, so that we can listen and learn with a little bit more context. We'll then, of course, get to why you're all really here, which is the voices of experience and the long haul COVID experiences with our incredible guest sharers, Mika, Karla, Jessica, and Derek. And we'll have time for discussion, questions and answers, and integrate and reflect in our practice. We have a unique gift to all of us this morning. We have a graphic recorder, Rio Holiday, who's going to be illustrating. It's going to be illustrating the conversation. And that's also partly there's a couple reasons why. And one of them is because in our learning about the experience of long haul COVID, we want to commit to creating learning that is the most accessible as possible. And sometimes speaking and sharing in words is one way to hold knowledge, but also seeing a visualization of an experience might be another. And so we're trying to create ways for us to engage in learning that also honors and reflects how we might need to be more intentional about creating accessible and loving spaces for those who are navigating long haul COVID and beyond. And then we'll close. Our essential question today is, how might the experience of surviving COVID-19 and experiencing long haul COVID-19 impact mental health? And what can and should we as mental health providers and leaders understand about that experience? That's our essential question for today. I'm going to open a poll just so that we can get to know where everyone is in their own learning. So you're going to see a poll come up in front of you. And the question is right now, what is your familiarity with COVID-19 and long haul? So you can please answer that. That will help both Kira, that will help our panelists, that will help all of us kind of level set of where we are. And you can answer any single one of them. So you either could be familiar, you could know someone, or you could yourself identify with someone who has had COVID-19 or has COVID-19. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer this. The numbers are going up. Beautiful. Yeah, you can answer any of the questions up in front of the poll. I'm familiar with, I know someone, or I might be someone who had or has. Okay. I'm going to wait 2 more seconds and then I'm going to end the poll. Okay. I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So there are about 50% of us that are familiar with what COVID-19, long haul COVID-19 is. So some of us have some familiarity and some of us are really new learners. There are maybe over half of us know someone who had COVID-19 that you might be in relationship with, or even yourself. And there are some of you who know people who are still holding on to the COVID-19 experience, whether that's a new variant or that is long haul. So thank you so much for sharing. That really helps us reflect the learning that we're in the room with. Okay. So I just want to say a couple things, which is that we're really here to surface the potential. We're really here to listen and learn. Some of us might feel like we're surfacing new knowledge. Some of us might feel like we are getting to explore how students might be impacted. Some of us might want to just hear that affirmation validation and really get to know the experience of what it has been like to have long haul COVID. I know for myself, speaking for Leora, that I have learned an enormous amount that has humbled me greatly from listening to Derek and Karla and Jessica and Mika. And it is a experience that not many people, that we haven't actually given a lot of attention to. We've really disenfranchised. And particularly as we think about moving into this next school year and we think about dedicating our school cultures to being recovery oriented, this experience is central to it. This experience is central to it. So the main piece of what brings us all here today that we're inviting you into is to listen and learn, to reflections and responses to really enhance our own practice. I'm going to invite Kelsey to introduce Kira, and then we'll get into listening.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Leora. You have such an amazing gift of creating welcoming and inclusive spaces, even in these very challenging Zoom environments. So thank you for making it feel like we're all just in your living room having a conversation, trying to learn more and grow and support one another. So it's my pleasure to get to introduce Dr. Kira Mauseth. If you have participated in some of the Northwest MHTTC series on disaster response and behavioral health, she has been leading those series, so she might be familiar to you already. For those of you who don't know Dr. Mauseth, she is a practicing clinical psychologist here in Washington, as well as a senior instructor at Seattle University, and has been serving as the co-lead for the behavioral health strike team in Washington for the State Department of Health. Her work and research focuses on resilience, on trauma and disaster and behavioral health. I don't know that I've shared this with her, but I have grown so much from the work that she has been doing and leading in our state around disaster and behavioral health. So just want to share my appreciation for that work that she's been part of. She's worked very extensively in Haiti with earthquake survivors, in Jordan with Syrian refugees, and with first responders and healthcare workers throughout the Puget Sound in the United States. She also conducts trainings, as I mentioned, with organizations and educational groups about disaster preparedness and resilience building within local communities. And as Leora said, Dr. Mauseth is going to do some level setting with us around some of these foundational questions around long haul. So I will, at this point, invite her to share with us. Thank you, Dr. Mauseth, for being with us.
Thank you for the intro. I'm really happy to be here and to share this time with you all. I really enjoy the opportunity to talk about sort of the collective experience that a lot of folks have been through, because I feel like just having a little bit of information sometimes, especially around validation, helps normalize what's going on and gives us a different perspective on what we've overcome. in terms of the like internal strengths and external resources that we've already got that we might not be paying very close attention to. And it also sheds a little light on where the things are that are still needed moving forward. So I'm just here to talk about, kind of the foundation and the baseline for where we have been operating in this last year and what long haul COVID kind of means as we move into this next really transitional period in the disaster response cycle. So to start off with, I was just checking out within the last couple of days, there's been there are new studies, there's new data, there's new information all the time, but a couple key points to start out with. In the United States alone, and I know we have guests and attendees here from not just in the US, but in the United States, we have 34 million people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19. Of that group, we have lost 603,000 people, which is an incredible devastation for many families. It's not just about individual people, it's about community loss, it's about all different types of grief and loss, and it's about the way that our lives have been affected and our bodies and our brains in so many different nuanced kinds of ways over the last year. So an incredible amount of loss and also an incredible amount of resilience. And that's what I'm going to kind of end on today before we turn it over to people who are going to share their experiences of resilience with you all. But to bring us back to long haul, an important key feature to recognize as we move forward is approximately 1/4, almost 25% of people who get a diagnosis of COVID-19 go on to experience at least one, and often cases, many more than one, additional symptom more than 30 days after their initial diagnosis. So the term long haul is about, it's an officially recognized term by the CDC. It's something that we absolutely need to take seriously and understand a little bit more in depth because it's going to affect kids in schools. It's going to affect teachers. It's going to affect families. And it's going to affect all of us in our communities as we collectively try to recover from this experience together. So the most common symptoms associated with long haul COVID are pain and breathing difficulties. There are also things like gastrointestinal issues and just a sheer sense of exhaustion that applies to a lot of different people. And it's not limited. It's not limited to just those four, just a handful of symptoms. It can be all variety of things that affect how people are able to engage with their lives. So it's definitely something that we need to honor and take seriously. To understand a little bit about where we are in this pandemic as a disaster, I'd really want to acknowledge the ways that our neurological presence are affected by this experience. There are four main categories of the way that human bodies are affected by disasters and disaster recovery, of which the pandemic certainly is one. Emotional, physical, cognitive, and behavioral. So to start very briefly with emotional concerns, most of us have been riding, for lack of a better term, an emotional roller coaster over the last year and a bit. We might snap at someone and then think, why did I just respond that way? You might snap at someone and then wonder to yourself, why did I just act that way? You might get up at whatever time you get up in the morning and think, I've got it today. I'm going to have a great Monday or Tuesday, or maybe most people don't say great Monday, but let's say great Thursday, great Friday. And then by the time you get to noon, you're so exhausted or you've had something happen that's just really upset things and it feels like the worst day you've had in a month. And that those ups and downs are really, really a normal part of the disaster recovery cycle in general. And they are certainly made more challenging by a diagnosis of COVID and the difficulty in struggling with ongoing symptoms. Other symptoms that are common for people in general in this time are physical symptoms. And usually physical symptoms are related to eating and sleep. So it's kind of a couple different options for that. If sleep seems to be something that you've been troubled by, and again, this applies to kids as well as adults, it's either that you can't turn your brain off at night, so you're lying there and just keep thinking and thinking and thinking, or you fall asleep without an issue and your brain turns on at like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, like, boop, ready to go, but you don't feel rested, right? So sleep regulation becomes a really challenging thing. One little tip I'm just going to offer to throw in is if you keep a notepad by the side of your bed, rather than picking up your phone and stimulating your brain even further at night, keep that notepad by the side of your bed and try to write down things that were successful today. The smallest things, give yourself credit for the things that are going well, the work that you're doing, and the effort that you're putting in. Again, on any level. Our brains don't do that naturally right now because of how stressed they are. So we're not really attending to the successes and the good things we're doing. When we draw our attention to that in the evening as we're trying to relax, that actually can help facilitate the sleep process. And likewise, if your brain wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you can write down on the notepad whatever it is that woke you up, whether it's an email to send or something that you need to get at the store or something to take care of. It takes that information out of your brain and onto the piece of paper, which is helpful because none of us can remember very much right now. And that brings me to the third bucket of how people are affected generally by COVID-19, which are cognitive symptoms. Most adults in the United States, and even I would argue around the world, feel like they have symptoms of either ADHD or they're concerned about early onset dementia. Most of us cannot remember what day of the week it is. We don't know why we just walked into the kitchen. We don't know, what we're supposed to do in a couple hours. We can't remember if we sent that email or not. It's easy to get confused. It's very hard to stay focused, and it's very easy to get distracted. Those are known symptoms associated with not just COVID-19, but with the survival of a large-scale disaster like the one that we have collectively experienced. So if those are things that you struggle with, please just recognize, we call it COVID brain at the Department of Health. That's not a technical clinical term, but just this idea that, our brains are under a great deal of stress. And particularly for those folks who have been struggling with and through a COVID-19 diagnosis and have that even in a more enhanced way, we need to have space for each other. We need to recognize that, we cannot produce and perform and engage in the way that we did pre-disaster or pre-COVID. We have to respect effort. We have to look at different ways of expressing appreciation for what people are doing and acknowledge the real sincere effort that is going into our participation in our day-to-day lives, including our work. The fourth bucket of things that are affected by COVID and the experience of living through this disaster are behavioral things. And what I mean by that is something that we refer to as acting out versus acting in. So acting out is, acting out and acting in are known common responses to disasters. And they're based on personality characteristics and all kinds of other things. There's nothing wrong with either one. All they mean is that for people who tend to act out, we tend to express our distress externally. It's outward facing. For people who act in, we tend to express our distress internally. So we pull that in. When it comes to survival and when it comes to resilience and when it comes to long-term processing from this pandemic, acting out and acting in can look very different than our normal characteristics. Acting out can look like being very aggressive. It can look like doing things that are out of character. It can look like yelling or being sort of hostile to other people, even when you don't intend to be. And on the other side of the coin is acting in, where it's a sense of hopelessness, giving up on things ever getting back to normal. Even when it's nice and the weather is changing, although it's a little hot around here these days, but that's a whole nother conversation. It's a sense of hopelessness, perhaps, that might not be characteristic of how you actually see things, but it feels really, really difficult. And both are potentially problematic, but they're both really normal in terms of behavior as we navigate this recovery process together. So those are just some things to keep in mind. I'd like to wrap up my summary by emphasizing that the most common outcome for any disaster is resilience. And human beings are incredibly resilient. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, is how to recognize and identify and develop those characteristics of resilience in ourselves and support that same development in our students, in our families, in our communities. There are 4 ingredients for resilience: purpose, connection, flexibility, adaptability, and hope. I use flexibility and adaptability kind of interchangeably, but it's the same idea. So the first one is purpose. And purpose is about recognizing that, especially for those folks who have been affected by long haul COVID, your sense of identity and your sense of purpose and your sense of motivation has been significantly challenged. I really like to use the word challenged rather than threatened, because when we can perceive things as a challenge rather than a threat, it changes our perspective on the recovery process. So our sense of purpose, and many people's sense of purpose, has been directly threatened by the experience of this pandemic. What got us out of bed 18 months ago is not the same thing that motivates us today. And so in order to build that ingredient of resilience, we need to reevaluate what our motivation is. We need to downsize and scale down our goals. We need to make sure that the goals we are setting for ourselves and for others in terms of expectations are the right size so that they're achievable and we can practice success. That reinforces purpose and that helps build resilience. The second ingredient in resilience is connection. Connection is also something that has suffered greatly with this pandemic. And we made a mistake at the very beginning by calling it social distancing instead of physical distancing. Human beings need social connection. We all do, of varying degrees, right? Some folks are fine with one or two, maybe a pet or a relationship with a higher power. That's fine. There are no wrong ways to have connection. Some folks need huge social networks, and there's no defining like baseline for what those needs are because they're so different for each person. But it's important to recognize what connections of yours remain strong, which ones need reevaluating, and where do you feel like the gaps may be, and enhance them in the way that's important or helpful for you. The third ingredient of resilience is adaptability, and that's the hard one, right? Adaptability is like, I call it the kale in the resilience smoothie. It's like the thing you have to have, but like I'm not a fan of kale, so I shouldn't say it like that, but it's the thing you have to have. Adaptability is probably the most important ingredient of resilience. And adaptability is not the same thing as acceptance, but it is about figuring out how to shift your thinking from being threatened by something to being challenged by it. If you perceive something as a threat, any unexpected change that happens in your life, if you see it as a threat, you're going to react to it you have a smaller number of options for how you can react. With threats, fight or flight gets engaged, and you can run, hide, or fight. And that's not a long-term strategy, right? And all of us have been threatened in some kind of a way or another this last year. So when you shift your thinking and you can teach your body to perceive something as a challenge, guess what? With a challenge, you can talk to others, you can participate in things, you can make other connections, you can break it down, work it out on a piece of paper, come up with your options, and piece by piece by piece, try to overcome it. So if we can shift our thinking from threat to challenge, the byproduct of that process is hope. And hope is the final element of resilience. So it's the thing that really is meaningful. It's the most meaningful element to people, and it is very different. People have very different experiences of hope depending on their life collective experience. Members of the BIPOC community in all of our families and communities have had very, very different experiences of what hope means throughout their life based on things like, marginalization and systemic racism and discrimination. So those experiences layered with all of the other direct primary impacts of COVID-19 and a diagnosis can compromise and challenge resilience for people. But I'll just end by saying that resilience remains the most common outcome for any disaster. And as you will hear, these individual experiences and these stories, this is living example of what resilience is and how powerful human beings can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for helping us level set, helping us understand the context of what all of us might be experiencing and also what some of us might be experiencing. I want to invite you in, if you have more questions about long haul, about disaster recovery, to put them in the Q&A. Kira has warmly invited us that she'll be answering questions throughout. And we also invite you to stay present and listen into the other ways of sharing experience and knowledge, which is our Voices of Experience. So I'm going to warmly, with lots of breath and excitement and humility, invite Karla and Jessica and Derek and Mika to come on to video. And I want to just offer those of you out there who might have PowerPoint curiosity, that we're actually going to be taking down the screen so that the real folks that you can rest your eyes on are our teachers for the next little bit under an hour. And you will have their bios and you have all the information about them on our event page. So here I am stopping to share the screen, a radical act. And I want to say a couple things before we get started. The first is that this is a warm conversation. So there might be questions that I'm going to direct to some of you, but of course, as you know, if you have anything else that you want to add, cosign, bop in, flavor up, please do. This is me sharing to Derek and Mika and Karla and Jessica. The other piece that I wanted to offer that we all discussed before today, and I'm going to say to all of you in the audience, is that part of one of the elements of being a COVID-19 survivor ally is recognizing that questions might need to be repeated again, that things might need to be said a little slower, that if recall happens with a little bit more time than maybe previous to experiencing COVID, that all of that's okay. And that all of us today in conversation are just going to support each other to show up in the ways that we most can in this moment. So without further ado, I'm going to invite first Derek, then Karla, then Jessica and Mika to please introduce your name and your pronouns, your relationship to young people and to school communities, and a little bit about your story with COVID-19 and long haul. So we'll start off with Derek. And we're gonna unmute you, Derek, because we want to hear you.
Just practicing, thanks. Hi, good morning and afternoon. My name is Derek Canty. I'm here in Las Vegas. I am a co-founder of an organization, 25 years old, called Peer Forward, formerly known as College Summit. We work with schools around the country to equip students that train their peers in how to navigate the college application process. My wife and I also do some work with teenagers here, just helping them, giving them coping skills, communication skills, financial literacy, and just helping them navigate, again, that transition from high school to college. I'm coming up on my 1-year anniversary. I don't really know how to feel about that, my 1-year anniversary where I contracted COVID. I was in the hospital for 10 days. Actually, the whole family came down with it at the same time. And so, yeah, it was 10 days of, it was tough because I was scared, my wife was scared, and come find out, even my doctors and nurses were scared because they haven't quite figured it out yet. They were pretty shook after the first round of wave of COVID, people coming to the hospital. So, my effects, Leora, right now, it ranges. Like I have one is that, I have no reserve tank. So my energy, as it's kind of built up a little bit over the year, when I'm done, I'm done. And there's just certain days where I don't have it. And, I have to be willing to be generous with myself, give myself grace and notice that. I also have trouble with short-term recall. And as we were talking on our previous calls, I do coaching, leadership coaching. So I have to I choose to tell my clients my story so that they know on different levels what I'm going through and what it's about. So I can let them know that if I do have short-term memory recall, I'll just tell them, I'll just say COVID, and they will laugh and I'll laugh, and they'll let me know what I was just talking about or what we were talking about, and it's all good. But it's not as easy as it seems. And then I think lastly, it's really anxiety. Anytime I have a cough, like now, anytime I have a little bit of a headache that spans more than 20 minutes, I have the worry that, oh man, did I contract it again? Is there something else wrong? So those are the main things for me.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you for being here. Okay, I'm going to invite Karla and then Jessica and Mika.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karla Monteroso. My pronouns are she, her, Aya. Coming to you from Los Angeles, otherwise known as Tongvaland. And I, I think my whole career has been dedicated in some ways to youth leadership. It started out in the college access space. And then in healthcare, as the ACA passed, and the utilization of college students to support really the understanding that people had around what it took to serve low-income patients. And then for the last 7 years, had been the CEO for an organization named Code 2040 that worked on the proportional representation of Black and Latinx people in tech, with programming for in particular for college students looking for internships, as well as doing a lot of work on the structural barriers to entry and retention and promotion. In terms of my COVID experience, it has been quite a journey. I had acute COVID for 2 months, so that was like a 2-month fever, where every 4 to 5 days my temperature went up into the stratosphere, and then came back down and was a low-grade fever. I had pneumonia for 17 days. I had, all sorts of tachycardia, have had all sorts of tachycardia, the inability to process information, pains in my legs and abdomen, which eventually resulted in the destruction of my gallbladder, which had to get taken out. Post the 2-month acute period, once I was no longer contagious, I've been working through what it has been to have long haul COVID until February of last year. This last year, I've been using a walker to get around places because while I was a weightlifter before this, and like a kayaker and whitewater rafter, and deadlifted like 220 pounds, all of a sudden walking down the block was a significant challenge. And I would say came close to dying twice during the acute period. And then since, had the removal of my gallbladder in October of last year, and about December started to see some improvements. I'm still on heart medication to keep my heart rate down, and they can't figure out why I have tachycardia. I have also have the cognitive losses. I have often described as like, sometimes you're looking at a spoon, it's a spoon, what it does, but cannot for the life of you come up with the word. And similarly, like a real monitoring of my energy levels. Like if I overdo it, I will be in bed for a set of days. And it will feel like not a choice. And I think often it's hard to describe to people in a way that they can understand, because when you think fatigue, you think, oh, you're tired and you're just going to take a little nap and it's going to be better. But when I talk about fatigue in a long hauler context, this is like, it's like you have weights on each eye, weights on your shoulders, weights on your pelvis, and everything, like gravity is pushing you into bed. And it feels like you are working very hard for your brain to swim to the surface and articulate what is happening to you. Over time, the amount of things that I can do has grown, exponentially, but we're still in a pretty glacial pace of recovery, while still like, at this point in time, certainly functional in a way I was not for most of last year. And am to this day incredibly grateful for the vast network of people that showed up for me in the last year and a half. Because I got sick on March 13th. So that was the first day of shelter in place in California. So really the first day everyone was finding out that we had to be masked up and indoors. By that time I was already sick, denied a test, and told that if I did not have relationships with people in China and Italy, I did not need a test and it would have no bearing on my treatment. And then having insurance treat you terribly because you have no proof that you had COVID, had an antibody test probably in about May or August that started to show in 2020, that started to show that I had COVID, which helped change some of the relationship around insurance carriers. And of course, the CDC coming out and saying that long COVID was an actual thing, but a real, and quite frankly, very racialized experience of not being believed by the healthcare industry. I got very lucky to meet an infectious disease doctor that believed me. And I had a primary care doctor that was my champion. But everything from emergency room doctors to rheumatologists to any number of specialists, that really boiled down my having long haul COVID being a problem of my eating habits when they had no knowledge of my eating habits, and inferring that the reason I had those problems was my racial identity. And so, I think that I've been really focused over the entire time of my disease to be very public about what I was going through, because I felt like a train was tearing its way through my community and no one was warning people at the levels that they needed to be warned. And the absolute fear that created for me. And over the course of the last year, had 21 people in my friends and family get COVID. Someone was in the hospital every month, from the beginning of the pandemic all the way through February of last year. Thank God for vaccines. We unfortunately lost my grandmother to COVID in December. So just a lot of loss there. I was communicating to Derek that I think, I see all of your messages on here and the ways each of you have been personally impacted by COVID, and just want to send my heart out to you. Like, it is always emotional for me when I realize how many of us really have been impacted by all of this. So and thank you to being community here.
Thank you, Karla. We'll have time to get into so much of what you offered after we hear from Jessica and then Mika, but I just wanted to reflect that I heard you say that you used to be a weightlifter, and then as you were using the analogy of weights on you, I thought, oh, you're just weightlifting in a different way in this time period. Okay, Jessica and then Mika, introductions, and then we'll be able to explore more.
Thank you, Leora. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jessica. Pronouns are she, her. And I'm in a very unique role today, actually, because I serve as the school mental health coordinator with the MHTTC network at the network coordinating office that's based out of Stanford School of Medicine. And so I work somewhat closely with Leora and Kelsey, my MHTTC colleagues who are hosting this event. But today I'm actually taking my MHTTC coordinator hat off, and we'll be speaking about my own personal experience as a 30-year-old Latina, previously served as a social worker at an outpatient clinic, providing bilingual mental health services to low-income, primarily Hispanic children and adolescents and their families. And I've also previously provided mentorship and counseling and mental health services in schools prior to my current role coordinating the MHTTC School Mental Health Initiative. And so just a little bit about my relationship with COVID. I do want to get into detail about some of the ongoing physical symptoms and mental health symptoms that have impacted me, since I do see that question in the chat box about what symptoms are the kinds that we see sometimes and if they vary day to day. So maybe in the other questions that will be asked today, I'll respond a little bit to that. But just very briefly, my relationship with COVID, I contracted the virus in March 2020. So very early on, just like Karla, before it was acknowledged that we were in a pandemic. And I experienced many of the common symptoms like fever, fatigue, loss of taste and smell, body aches. I was misdiagnosed with having a nasal infection. They did not think I had COVID, even though at the time everyone was starting to panic and think, oh my God, this is spreading across the country. Do we have it? Do we not? And so I was diagnosed with a nasal infection, was given antibiotics. Then shortly after that, continued to have shortness of breath. I started vomiting. I couldn't eat anything. I ended up going to the emergency room was diagnosed with pneumonia. They said I had an infection in my right lung, and still they sent me home with antibiotics. They refused to test me for COVID because at the time, tests were still so limited. And they told me, you're young, for the most part, you're healthy, you don't have any underlying medical conditions. We don't think you have COVID. And they sent me home that same day. Less than 24 hours later, I was back in the emergency room. The shortness of breath had gotten worse. They did some more scans. They saw that the pneumonia was worsening, and they finally decided to test me. And the next day they were like, yeah, you're positive for COVID. We're keeping you here. We want to monitor your lungs, and so I was hospitalized for about 6 days. And since then, I think that I have, for the most part, recovered from the physical symptoms of COVID. But I do want to say that my mental health and my emotional well-being from that experience with COVID is what I continue to manage as best I can every day. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but that's just a little bit about my experience with COVID and my experience in working with within the school mental health field.
Thank you, Jessica. All right, Mika, round us out in our intros.
Hi, I'm Mika, she, hers. My work with youth started about 7 years ago when I founded a writing support group program for teens. And we worked together to develop their own narrative and harness what their narrative is. We also work on a variety of topics of discussion, from financial literacy to sex education. And then my personal experience with COVID, I contracted it the week of May 17th and then quickly deteriorated and was hospitalized about 4 times. It was around inflammation around my heart and lungs. So just saw the complete deterioration of all of my basic abilities be taken away from me. And so my wife became my main caregiver, and really for about 6 months, I was in bed and unable to walk or really talk because of shortness of breath. And yeah, my entire life changed, and my identity to myself changed completely. And similar to what Jessica just said, in December, November is when my physical symptoms really started to settle. But as I'm now left here, a year later, it's definitely on my mind that I think like this time last year, I was in the depth of the experience, and now I'm sitting here with all of you talking about this. I definitely feel the remaining effects on my mental health and my needing to redefine what things look like for me and how I identify to myself. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you, Mika. Thank you. The full disclosure is that Mika, Jessica, Derek, and Karla are all colleagues and dear friends and mentors of mine. And so I just want to name that it brings up a lot for me, and still being reminded of your stories and how much those of us who love you knew and also didn't know. And I think that that's a shared experience I'm seeing in the chat box of folks who've lost loved ones to COVID, folks who are having resonance, folks who may not have known and are now having a moment of empathy. Like there's a lot of stuff that comes up. And I just want to remind us as we're listening to hydrate yourself, to feel free to walk while you're listening to this, to find a way to support your body to be in listening. And also, if listening in this moment just doesn't support you in this moment, don't stretch yourself. We're recording, you can listen to it later. Don't go beyond what you need to go. So speaking of not understanding and misunderstanding and under-understanding, I'm going to turn it to Mika and Karla as long haulers. And I'd also be curious if you want to even share, like, does that name even resonate with you? Should we even be saying that in the school mental health world? But I'm curious if you might share, for those of us who didn't have COVID, who aren't diagnosed with long haul, what do we need to know? Like, what is misunderstood? And also, particularly for the context of the folks who are in this room, what do folks who work in schools and in school mental health and in mental health need to know that we just don't know? Karla and Mika, and of course, anyone else who wants to chime in.
Go for it, Mika.
Okay. One thing that I wanted to talk about is I think all of us contracted it quite early on. And there was such a lack of trust. So while you're experiencing these obscure, random, for what felt like random symptoms that didn't feel connected, you go into a place of health and healthcare, and they're trying to understand what's going on. Such a lack of trust in what you're experiencing, a lot of questioning of what's going on for you. And then for me, what happened with that is I started to question my own experience and would constantly test my symptoms because I was experiencing such a lack of trust from the doctors I encountered. So I would because I couldn't really speak without gasping for air, I would try to count how many words I could get out and just constantly question my own experience until the very end. And now even looking back, I think there's an element of that. So that really was something that I think I'm rebuilding now around trusting my own intuition and trusting the symptoms that I'm seeing. And also it was during my 4th hospitalization that I found out what long haul was. And I remember my cardiologist came into my room and she said, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal. And she's like, there was an article published about what this thing called long haul. And I think this might be you. And up until this point, we were desperately trying to find the answer to my symptoms, the thing that will make me be able to breathe again, have my heart settle. So they were trying all these medications on me, all of these different things. And when she said, you might just be this thing they're calling a long hauler, although it felt helpful that there was a name for it, that was one of the hardest moments of hopelessness because you realize this might just be what my life is now. You all don't know anything that's going on, and you're sending me home and telling me that this is okay. And you're discharged with a list of symptoms. And if you have those symptoms, to call 911. I'm leaving the hospital with all of those symptoms. And you're telling me that that's okay. And the amount of times that they would, I went to talk to my doctor in the hospital and she said, you need to call 911 because of how you sound. And I was like, I'm literally in the hospital right now. So there was just such a lack of literacy to support us. And I really feel like it was so led by people who were sick that helped bring this understanding forward because the doctors did not lead that for us. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll definitely co-sign all of that. I think some of the most frustrating moments in healthcare that I had was when actually the stuff was getting published and news stories were out about it and doctors still were ascribing so many very physical impacts as an anxiety provoked reaction, an exaggeration. One experience I had to go to the hospital. My blood pressure had dropped to 52/75. And the ambulance had come to pick me up. And when they took my blood pressure, the ambulance did not believe that was my actual blood pressure. So they took it 3 more times. As I stood there, they're like, if you really had this blood pressure, you would be passed out. And I was like, all of the literature talks about happy hypoxia and what it means that COVID patients present in a particular way, but are having these symptoms that can have major crashes. And I had a neighbor tell them get her in the effing ambulance because she was very scared for me. And then I get to the hospital and my oxygen rates are cycling between 70 and 90. And the doctor is like, this isn't a big deal. And that I think there's that feeling of disbelief. And then there's also like hey, I am offering you, these are the articles, this is the literature, and the doctor being like, no. It's, I know what this is. And, I think if you lose some weight, it'll be great. Like if you don't eat as many tortillas and beans I got once, you'll get better. So it was, I think that there were two stages to that for me, of like the point where no one knew anything and where groups of people started to know things, but my doctors refused to believe or look into them. And then the after of like having to manage a healthcare system that was determined.
Derek, do you want to pick up on maybe what Karla was offering?
Yeah, I just know from, what I'd say to people that haven't had it, experienced it, was that, especially around schools and our kids, is that one thing I saw months later was that my wife had PTSD from the whole experience. And that bottom line is that a lot of your kids might be experiencing that if their parents had it, or vice versa. And so that, it's a tough thing, and there's a lot of reaction now to that. There's a lot of fear underneath it. It's just been sad that 600,000 plus lives have lost. And we live in a country where our leadership didn't take it seriously in the beginning, and we didn't devote resources to it. How many of those 100,000 would have been saved? And so I agree with Mika that there's a lot of lack of trust there. And it's so many layers of that underneath it, that there's a lot of feelings and emotions that lie underneath that for me, especially the students that we work with. So I know we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that PTSD is very, very real for your families and students you work with. So
Yeah.
for me, it's about, sorry, Leon, for me, it's about going back to school. It's about having those honest conversations. It's about not trying to go back to business as usual, because people are still, even though we're going back to business as usual as an economy, mentally and emotionally, a lot of us is still back months ago, even though it's June 25th.
Right. I think that that's such an important, what I've learned from you all directly and indirectly, is that we keep using language like we're going back or we're recovering. And there are folks where that word has a really different meaning, and many folks who are still feeling like they're surviving and not even in recover. And so how do we create both collective language, but with deep attunement to the individual experience based on a lot of folks? The term that came up for me, Jessica, listening to you, and Karla will come back on. She just got a little internet kick out. And Derek and Mika, is many of you are familiar on this call with Sandra Bloom's work of the sanctuary model. And Sandra Bloom came up with the term sanctuary trauma, that the experience of when you are going to systems or providers expecting to be treated, served, or healed, and actually experience disenfranchisement and disbelief from those who are supposed to provide for you. And so you experience this kind of tension of expecting to have gotten sanctuary and actually experience more harm from those who are supposed to be providing sanctuary to you. And I think it's an important call for those of us in school mental health and who are providers, that even if we weren't the ones providing that sanctuary trauma, we still might be associated with providers, and there still might be that lack of trust of not having been believed by folks who have experienced long haul COVID. Well, you're back. We're happy to have you back. Okay, I'm going to shift. We're not shifting gears, but we're going to we've got two big questions. So I'm just cueing you on for those of you on our panel, that we're going to go first to the disparity and intersectionality question, and then to the experience of students question. Okay. So Karla definitely named this. Y'all have named this in our conversations. I think the conversation around disparity and the experience of intersectionality in your COVID and long haul experience is really necessary to take not only a moment, but the moment to name. And as a group of voices of experience who either identify as folks of color or as queer or both, how have your experiences impacted the way, how have your identities, your social identities, your work identity, all the identities that you identify with, for lack of a better word, how have they impacted the way you experience harm and healing? So it's open to anyone. Jessica, you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Leora. This is a really great question. And, contracting COVID-19 is, many of us know, more likely among Black, African-American groups and Hispanic, Mexican-American, Latino groups. And, I myself am a part of that group, and my family is a part of that group. And back in March 2020, when I contracted COVID, to be honest with you, my parents didn't even believe that COVID was real. They were hearing about it in the Spanish news, and they were like, oh, it's nothing. It's probably just like the flu. I heard a lot of people saying that early on. And so when I was hospitalized and the trauma that I went through and the trauma that my family went through, not being able to go visit me in person, I was only able to talk to them. Thankfully, my husband brought me my iPad and the nurses were able to get it to me in the room, and I was able to FaceTime them. But even then, I couldn't really speak a lot because of the shortness of breath. And so them seeing me struggling in the hospital room by myself, couldn't get up to go use the bathroom without a nurse coming and carrying me over. That whole traumatic experience, it wasn't just traumatic and eye-opening for me, but it was so eye-opening for them. And so that was a whole experience in and of itself, with the many cultural considerations and barriers that I have to consider in my family. And just for myself, being a child of working class parents, of immigrant parents, it was a lot. And so in terms of healing, I read a fun fact the other day on my Instagram. I follow a page called Latinx Therapy, and they provide a lot of fun facts. And I'm going to read it out loud because it really resonated with me and really relevant to this question. So it says, children of working class families and immigrants often internalize and minimize their stress and anxiety as invalid or less than due to the magnitude of their parents' hardships. And I think that is so true because I found myself doing that while I was in the hospital. And in the months after my discharge from the hospital, I was just trying to not worry my parents, who already had so much they were dealing with during the pandemic, such as loss of work and income due to the pandemic. And so I think that we need to keep that in mind. For many of our youth, many of the students we work with who identify as people of color, who come from families, working class families, and have immigrant parents, they may deal with the same or similar and feel that they need to minimize their traumatic experience with COVID and minimize the grief and loss that comes with it. And we need to be mindful of how that impacts our youth. And just another quick point before I let my other fellow panelists here pitch in. I also just want to bring up that something else that impacts our communities of color at a higher rate than their counterparts is gun violence. And I bring this up because our country has obviously experienced many tragic losses due to gun violence in this past year and a half. And at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially, and we have to think about the layers of loss and grief and trauma that's experienced by people of color, especially. And I want to share that I myself, unfortunately, experienced a very tragic loss during the pandemic, just 4 or 5 months in my recovery from my COVID hospitalization. My 24-year-old brother was shot and killed in August 2020. And that was just very, very traumatic, very difficult to cope with, on top of my recovery and my healing process from COVID. And so I just imagine, if it's been so difficult for me as an adult, imagine our youth, our students, our children who are also dealing with not just COVID-related trauma and loss and grief, but that trauma, loss, and grief that comes from other factors that impact our communities of color more than others. Gun violence, poverty, lack of resources, other factors that greatly impact these communities. It's a lot to deal with. And so we need to keep that in mind in the work that we do and how we support our youth.
Yeah, I would add there that like I still worry about my mother. Like my mom faced the possibility of losing her daughter and she did lose her mother to this disease. And we've talked a lot about going to therapy, and it has been an impossible search to find a therapist that is Spanish speaking and can support. Like only 5% of all therapists are Spanish speaking, and only 3% of those therapists are Latinx. And I think that's happening in really big numbers. And so on top of all of these things that have happened, the traumas are unprocessed and fresh and have a lot of PTSD attached to them without, and for those, even for those who are willing, like literally have watched my mother for the last 6 months diligently try to get a therapist and be unable to access that care and support, much less have it be covered by insurance. And so that I think is when we're thinking about our young people in schools, like they have like if they got COVID, their parents are traumatized, right? Like there's just no way that a parent watches their child go through an acute case or a long hauler case and doesn't feel some level of trauma. And they have a very difficult time accessing support, on top of all the ways in which they're not believed because of their race specifically.
Yeah. Mika, did you have anything else you wanted to add? I want to move us to the last question before we open it to Q&A. There's so much going on in Q&A, and this is incredibly powerful.
I'm good, Leora, thanks.
You're good. Okay. So Karla, you beautifully just brought us into the last question before we go into more questions. Thinking about the potential impact of students who have had COVID or trauma associated with COVID, students who might be impacted because their caregiver had COVID or is a long hauler, or students who are impacted because their teacher or administrator had COVID or is a long hauler, which is a really unique experience that many students had this year with loss of their educators, their caretakers. I'm curious what comes up for the four of you that you want folks to hear, folks to consider in our practice.
What comes up for me is just a lot of feelings of sadness. There's just so many levels that as a African-American male, I felt last year, even before I contracted COVID, seeing a man like that looks like me get murdered on TV and video. And we can't subtract that from this whole pandemic and what all of us have had to deal with. Like that's on top of that. And I just know that a lot of the people in my community, especially the males, they won't talk about it. I know a lot of them, which is why I posted a picture of myself in the hospital to generate that conversation. I know a lot of them will say they have had it. They'll say they got sick, but it wasn't COVID. And knowing that they were sick and they probably did have it. And so I know that's going to impact, and a lot of those are fathers. And so I know that impacts those students, your students. I know that, continually it's how do we have those honest, real conversations that our kids are ready for. They need to have these real and honest conversations in the schools in a very safe environment. For me, that's where the power lies, in an honest conversations where students can really talk about what they were faced, how they overcame it, what they're still dealing with, actually connecting to resources. Those are all critical pieces, but the conversations need to be had, and but our students are ready. I believe they are. They're couched not to speak about it, as most in a lot of our cultures, but they are ready to speak about it. So I would say, in whatever way you can, I think that's critical.
Thank you.
I wanted to piggyback that a bit, Derek, around the honest conversations with young people. I feel like after enduring something like this, whether personally or witnessing somebody in their family, there's new feelings of otherness and inability to relate and connect, because they will come back to their friend group potentially feeling completely transformed and not able to relate in the same way. So if there could be pathways developed for these young people of how to reconnect to their peers, how to connect to what they experience and learn how to communicate it, I'm doing that myself. And for young people, they really need that support. And as a facilitator in a school space, when I was sick, the students were told about my experience. So I was getting really beautiful, warm messages from them, but a lot rooted in fear for me, fear for themselves. And I wasn't in the position to manage or hold space for that because I was in my own sense of fear. So needing the support of staff to sort of take that role off of the person who's in the experience to help them process what's happening when they're witnessing it from like a facilitator or a teacher.
That's so powerful, Mika. It speaks, so it's a call into those of us to be long haul allies, truly, and to create, what I heard from all of you is use direct language. We don't need to live in euphemisms. We can be clear about what we know and what we don't know. And we as adults can model not knowing and also model what it means to show up and support in collective care. And Mika, what I heard in your call-in is to not turn to the people who are battling, to then be our teachers of the battle. And that's a beautiful teaching for this experience and probably for a lot of other experiences. It speaks to what someone put in the Q&A that I want to lift up. The question is this: how do we as school mental health providers balance addressing, right, the impact of COVID and exhaustion, and the exhaustion of dealing and talking about it? So this kind of tension point with those of you who are living this every single day, and maybe others who are less proximate to it, but are feeling generally burned out or fatigued by the conversation about it. And I'm curious what comes up for you, particularly thinking about many folks on the line who are going to be training teachers, training school mental health providers, coming back to school this fall. So how do we both address it and also understand the fatigue about addressing it?
I think one of the things I'm most afraid of in the return to school is the criminalization of Black and Latinx people who are disproportionately impacted by this, and for whom the cognitive losses may show up as a lack of attention in class. And I think that it is just going to be so easy to make those kids into like not being disciplined or not coming back to school in the right way. And I think in the absence of, like, I think one of the strategies I think has to be an intercession with discipline at the school level, so that when folks are being sent to the principal's office or are being given detention, that there is another layer, another check there. Because if the weight is for the mental health providers at the school to be able to interpret this, it takes out a whole range of things that are happening in the day-to-day experience of those young people that they themselves cannot explain.
Anyone else have invitations for how we balance both the fatigue and naming and normalizing the fatigue? Oh, yep, Kira's back. Yep.
I am.
Great, Robin.
Karla, I really appreciate what you're saying, and I totally agree with you. And I think that if we were to replace COVID as the topic with any other serious systemic issue that needs to be talked about, but also people don't quite know how, or I don't know. It still has to be done, right?
I was thinking the same thing in the parallel to racism of like folks being like, oh, I'm so tired of talking about racism. It's all the time. And then there are folks who are like, cool, I have to live it every day. So
right. Racism, gender identity, equity, right. Yes, absolutely. That's what came up for me too. And so the conversations need to happen, whether people are comfortable with them or not, because that's the work moving forward. However, I guess it's not a but, it's an and. And I think we need to be aware about the traumatic aspects of this. And I'm sure you all already know this anyway, but not requiring people to participate in groups and in discussions where they feel like they need to disclose about what their own experience has been, because that's when clinically, at least, it crosses a line. It can potentially re-traumatize people. So whether or not the topic is racism or marginalization or COVID, right, we want to try and facilitate and provide the safe space for people to contribute when they want to, like what we're doing today. But from a school systems perspective, to not require engagement on a personal disclosure level. I think there does need to be a level of required engagement around data, right, about what's happening, but not asking people necessarily to self-disclose. So it's a very, very delicate balance, but it's a process that we, I think, as a humankind are necessarily having to engage in. We need to do this, and that's going to facilitate resilience as well. So maybe that's not a direct answer. But
I'm gonna offer us to just do a little bit of a lightning round to go. Oh gosh, I'm gonna try and do this alphabetically. I'm gonna mess this up. Derek, Jessica, Karla, Mika, in a lightning round of last things that you would like folks to hear. And Jessica, I'm gonna invite you to kind of name what you just messaged me. But last, like a 1 sentence or 2 sentence that you would like us to sit with, and then we will move into integrating our learning, see the visual that Rio has been creating from this conversation, and come to some integration. So we'll go Derek, Karla, Jessica, Mika. Last sentence or a couple words you would like folks to hear.
So thank you for everybody for being here and participating. I would just say that one thing I would want to just leave with is that this experience is, as for a lot of us, have brought me connected more to more human beings outside of my social circle. Just in my experience, in my heart, and what I've gone through, and hearing what they've gone through. And I would say if across the board, teacher training and awareness around this and the long hauler effect is couched in that and understanding from here, but also as well from here, metrics and the data, but from the heart, there'll be some great understanding and capacity to really support our kids this year.
Nice, beautiful, thank you. All right, did I do Jessica? I mean, I don't have COVID brain, but Jessica, then Karla, then Mika. Who knows the alphabet anyway? Jessica.
Yeah, I know. I wish that we had more time, because I know there's still a lot more that we can talk about, but I really wanted to just quickly mention something about the importance of, teachers, school mental health personnel, school mental health providers, administrators, etc., prioritizing their own mental health and healing if they've had COVID or have COVID-related trauma themselves. It goes back to that saying that we need to help ourselves before we can help others. And so I know we've been talking a lot about how our youth, how our students, how our children can be impacted by COVID, but we also want to take a step back and acknowledge that we ourselves, as school mental health providers, as people who work in this mental health field and support our youth, need to take care of ourselves. I remember that when I first had COVID, I went back to work like a week after being discharged from the hospital, trying to just get myself back to normal, trying to feel like I'm getting back into the same routine. And I put so much pressure on myself. Had I not had a supportive team, I feel like I probably would have suffered even more mentally and emotionally from my COVID experience. And so I really just want to remind everyone that although the physical symptoms from COVID might be, settling and you're improving. I just think that it's always important for us to look at our own mental health and take a step back and see, like, we need to process how I'm feeling mentally, emotionally, and, work can wait. Just really wanting to prioritize our own self-care and really being mindful that we need to be okay in order to properly support our youth.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, Karla and then Mika.
I think the numbers really indicate the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black, Latinx, and Native people. And strategy needs to be created that is conscious of that disproportionate impact. That if we wait only for the students that are going to speak up and who feel perfectly comfortable with, those voices may not be the voices of all of the people impacted. And then immediately, like from the thick of the pandemic, then all our young people and educators of color watched a man lynched on TV and social media over and over and over again, saying he couldn't breathe after a experience of a disease that was also taking away people's ability to breathe. And everything we do needs to be conscious of that impact and what it means to hold that space for those young people and to believe them, to like really, really index on believing them and the teachers and administrators impacted by this in this way, so that we are coming up not just with responsive strategies, but proactive strategies for their care and healing.
Thank you, Karla. Thank you. Believe them. Okay, Mika, last words, and then we're going to close us out.
It's honestly a reminder to myself, but for people who have students in their lives or friends or loved ones, or if it's you yourself who had this experience, to remember that even if you're not physically still suffering, the effects are still really there. So even months later, a year later, to check in, like, how am I doing? How is this person I know doing? Even though they're not being rehospitalized, they're not showing me physically what's going on, I should just ask them, like, how are you doing recalibrating into life? And with everyone, especially in Los Angeles, things are going back to normal. I think that can also be really activating for people who've had the experience. So to just check in with yourself and the people that you love or support who've had this experience.
Thank you, Mika. The power of breath and the privilege of breath. I'm offering those of us in conversation to end with some reflection. And while we do that, I'm going to invite Rio to share her screen of the visual, speaking of believe them, of other ways that we can validate what we heard you. And as you are sharing your meaning making of what came up today, I'm going to just offer this beautiful visual that Rio literally created in the last 90 minutes in this conversation that will go out to all of you, that you can then share along with the recording. And we invite you to put, this is so beautiful, Rio, and you can see believe them being written in live. We invite you to put your learnings and your meaning making in the chat box that Rio will also add. And if looking inward isn't of access, then I also want to offer the looking outward reflection, which is, what of this conversation do you want to bring back to your other worlds? What of this conversation do you want to bring back to your other worlds? So we have as we close, I'm going to offer a couple things. Rio, please keep your screen up so that we can land on this gorgeous visual. I want to offer on a couple closing pieces. One, which is a beautiful thank you, and we please invite you to fill out an evaluation, because this might be something you might want to continue your learning about. That on our website, there are both hotline resources if you need to seek resources, and long haul support resources that our panelists have surfaced. That we're getting a ton of love in the chat box. And I want to end on a really, really, really deep, warm love, thank you. To Kira, to Jessica, to Derek, to Mika, and to Karla, for you and for bringing your voices of experience and your courage to this space. There's been a lot of impact. I'm going to invite all of you to please hydrate yourself. Find someone that you'd like to share one thing that you heard today that you want everyone else to know. That's part of the way that we can be long haul allies, and to also know that you are not alone. that is such a fallacy. But we are all deeply connected and perhaps need to be even in more attuned connection to be the kind of allies that we need to be to show up and support for one another. On behalf of the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, the National Coordinating Office, all of the MHTTCs, and the Northwest MHTTC, we're so grateful for you for taking your time this June 25th morning. You will get all the resources and recordings and anything else you need in order to carry on in your courage. And again, a huge thank you. Please join me in a huge thank you to Mika and to Jessica, and to Derek and Kira and Karla for sharing what you're holding on to, so that maybe we can show up around you and help you hold it on. Help you hold it on? That's not what I want to say. Help you hold it. You know, Karla said you were dedicating your learning to those who have helped keep you alive this year. And this session has deeply helped us support others to live and want to live moving forward.